50-50 elections are very bad for political parties because you don't learn any lessons from losing. You only learn lessons when you lose big, right? Republicans learned something when they lost massively in 1964 or when they lost in a big way to Bill Clinton in 92. Democrats learned a lot from losing 49 states to Ronald Reagan in 1984. When you lose narrowly, you just think, well, I'm just going to do the same thing next time and it'll work. And both parties have been doing this now for 30 years, and it does work, right? I mean, Republicans are literally now running the same person who lost the last election against the person he lost to. That is an insane decision for a political party to make, even putting aside how crazy it is to run Donald Trump in the first place. But in a way, both parties have been doing this now since the end of the Cold War, just doing the same thing over and over, not taking account of the fact that the electorate is actually changing underneath them, that there are new things they could say to new voters. I think it's going to take some real political talent for somebody to break through and figure out how to make new friends and keep the old. It's a little easier to imagine a Republican doing that, but it could easily happen in either party.
And clearly it's not going to happen in 2024, which is a replay on steroids in less pleasant ways than 2020. But there might be an opening for that in 2028, simply because both political parties are going to have to renew themselves, perhaps not ideologically and programmatically, for I hope they will, but at the very least in terms of who is at the top of the ticket and therefore what kind of message they can send. At the risk of trying the patience of my American listeners, I'm going to use a soccer analogy. When you, and I know that one of the things that Americans don't like about soccer is that you can sometimes have a draw, God forbid. And it does feel like we've been in a draw in American politics with occasional victories one way or the other, but nobody is able to win the decisive victory. Now, when you have an outcome that's 0-0 in a soccer match, it might be that both sides are playing at the best of their abilities. Both teams are playing incredibly well, but it's just the defense and the goalkeepers are so good that they don't concede a single goal. More often when it's a 0-0, it's because both teams are a little bit uninspired, and they're both making many mistakes. They're both screwing up, converting their chances. And I feel like that is the specific kind of draw that we're in. It's not just that the parties are evenly matched, which might be helpful if they're both actually able to mobilize broad segments of a population and enthusiasm for their program. It's that the weakness of the Republicans is allowing Democrats to be sloppy in their strategy and unimaginative in their policy. And the weakness of the Democrats is allowing Republicans to get away with things that they simply should not be able to get away with in terms of the quality of the candidates.
There's a history here to point to also, because I think that in the course of the Cold War, we actually went through a period where both parties had some exceptional strengths, and they were often tied too, but in a different way. The Democrats dominated Congress for 40 years, from the 1950s to the 1990s. They were clearly the majority party, if you just looked at Congress. They literally controlled the House continuously from 1954 to 94. And yet, at the same time, Republicans were winning presidential elections. Most presidential elections. We're always very impressed by the presidents of the 1960s, Kennedy and Johnson, but those were the only Democratic presidents in that stretch. And the other exception, Jimmy Carter, could easily have been a Republican. He was a very conservative Democrat. That's a situation where you have two strong parties, and it creates some very peculiar election outcomes. 1972, Richard Nixon won 49 states, and the Democrats increased their congressional majorities at the same time. Those are two strong parties in different ways, but two strong parties. We're living now with two weak parties, and there's no question about it, because the only thing either party can think to say to voters is that it would be really bad if the other party won. We are not having a lot of policy debates. It is not clear what a victory by one or the other will really bring for the country. We're having an election now where no one's even thought to ask, what would Joe Biden do in a second term? It's not even a subject of discussion, right? Because the purpose of voting for Joe Biden would not be to give Joe Biden a second term. It would be to prevent Donald Trump from being president.